In the first 4 units of Safe Start, we discussed a variety of concepts that can greatly reduce the risk of injuries at home, on the road, and on the job. We talked about injuries as the result of contact with hazardous energy, the relationship between unintentional or habitual behavior and injuries, the various states that lead to the errors that cause injury, and ways to avoid making those critical errors. Now, along with my friends Pete and Linda, it's time for you to put all of those concepts together to make them part of your daily routine, your game plan for reducing mistakes or errors that increase the risk of injury. Think of those concepts as 4 critical error reduction techniques.
The first is to self-trigger on the state or the amount of hazardous energy to prevent making a critical error.
Then, analyze the small errors that you do make, bumps and bruises, before you find yourself seriously hurt.
Then watch other people for their state to error patterns to increase awareness of your own behavior.
Finally, work on improving your own habits.
There are 4 practical steps to efficiently minimize the errors that increase the risk of injury. Here's a closer look at each one. To start, self-trigger on the state or amount of hazardous energy to prevent making a critical error. It's important to recognize when you're
rushing,
frustrated,
fatigued,
or complacent.
By realizing that you're in one of these states, all of which increase the risk of making a critical error, you can do something about it before you make the mistake.
And before you get hurt.
Self-triggering on a state does take some practice, but when you begin to realize the impact on safety, it's easy to make the effort. Take rushing, for instance, a common state for many people today, right? Kind of scary when you consider that rushing can easily cause you to make any one or even all 4 critical errors. And the more errors you make, the greater your chance of injury.
Even if you can't slow down, you can remind yourself to think about what you're doing, to watch your surroundings, look for line of fire problems, or anything that could cause you to lose your balance, traction, or grip.
Frustration is one of the states that many people find difficult to trigger on immediately.
That's because you don't usually start out frustrated. It's not until you're well into a task and not getting anywhere that you find yourself getting stressed out. And at that point, you're not thinking about the potential for getting hurt. That's why you've got to react as soon as you realize you're getting stressed out or frustrated, before you get your thumb directly in the line of fire, or something worse.
Now, while fatigue is a little easier to recognize, the problem comes if you don't realize just how tired you really are, especially when it physically slows down your reflexes.
Like when you're on the road and you convince yourself that you're alert enough to make it home. But whether you're on the road or on the job, you need to notice those little mistakes that you don't usually make and realize they're probably due to fatigue. Or if you do actually feel fatigued, stop, take a break, grab a cup of coffee. Try some exercise to get your energy level up, or if at all possible, get some rest. It's easy enough to recognize fatigue, but it's amazing how often we think we can fight it off. And that's just the time you can get into real trouble.
Complacency is probably the toughest to trigger on because it tends to creep up on you over time. When you deal with some hazard repeatedly over days, weeks, maybe years, you're bound to become less apprehensive or concerned about the risk. Eventually, you may not pay very close attention to the task. From there, it's pretty easy to take your eyes off what you're doing, move into the line of fire, or lose your balance, traction, or grip. One way to fight complacency is to actively look for it and remind yourself about the amount of hazardous energy around you. That awareness can increase the attention you pay to a task and help eliminate the complacency that develops over time. But perhaps the best way to fight complacency is to look for the patterns that increase the risk of injury in other people. Every time you do this, it will automatically bump your own level of thinking or awareness.
Keep in mind that in some situations, rushing, frustration, fatigue, and complacency may not be a problem, but you might be dealing with enormous amounts of hazardous energy, like power saws, heavy equipment, high speed, or temperature extremes.
When those things come into play, you can also use them as a trigger to remind yourself to keep your mind and eyes on task, to avoid the line of fire, and to maintain your balance, traction, or grip.
While you're getting better at triggering on the 4 states, you still may make some mistakes. So it's important to continue analyzing those close calls and small errors to figure out just what caused the error. Was it a state like fatigue or frustration that caused an error? If so, then ask yourself why you didn't notice the state and use it as a trigger to look for and think about line of fire and balance, traction, or grip errors. On the other hand, perhaps it was a habit like eyes not on task or mind not on task that caused the problem. Realize that if the circumstances were different and involved more than one state or critical error, or if the hazardous energy were greater, the consequences might have been far worse.
Learn from the small accidents, and hopefully you can prevent having to learn from the big ones.
The third critical error reduction technique is to look for the state-to-error patterns in other people's behavior. This does 2 things. It helps you avoid being injured by their critical errors, and it can also make you more aware of your own behavior. You can look for these patterns in anyone, in any situation, at work, at home, or on the road. If you see someone speeding or not paying attention on the road, keeping a safe distance from that person will certainly lessen your risk of injury. But just recognizing that person's state-to-errors pattern is a great reminder of the risk it presents. And it's a good way, maybe the best way, to fight complacency, which is a common problem on the road.
The last of the 4 error reduction techniques is to make a conscious effort to work on your habits. This goes back to analyzing those close calls or small accidents to determine if some habit played a part, and working to change it the next time around. Practice keeping your eyes on the road or getting them back on the road quicker, even if you drive the same route every day. Get in the habit of always wearing appropriate protective equipment until it feels more normal with it than without it. Start with the habits you know have caused you some problems in the past and go from there. To learn more about the 4 critical error reduction techniques, turn to the Unit 5 workbook. When you're finished, come back to the videotape for some examples of how to use these techniques to prevent injuries.